Today I'm going to tell you a story about a young woman who stole a name to escape a blood-stained past, about a little girl who hadn't spoken a word since the day her mother died, and about a man whose heart had been winter for far too long. They didn't meet by fate, but everything changed with a whisper, "Come home, Mama." But don't think this is just a love story, because behind a locked door atop Broken Arrow Ridge lies a secret, one that could burn everything to the ground. If stories like this stir something deep in you, subscribe now. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The train hissed into the Broken Arrow Ridge station like a wounded beast spitting steam into the thawing Wyoming air. Snow still lined the ridgetops and pine-covered slopes, but in the valley below, spring had begun to wrestle winter into retreat. The platform was slick with meltwater, and the muddy road beyond glistened under the dull sun. Sara Whitlock stepped down from the last car, with her carpetbag clutched tight, and her heart beating even tighter. Her dress, once a respectable navy blue, had faded and torn in places. She wore a shawl too thin for the mountain chill, and boots a size too small, pinching her toes with each trembling step. She looked like a girl who had run far and fast, and she had. She wasn't Pearl Coulter, but the woman named Pearl had died 3 nights earlier on the train, somewhere between Denver and Salt Lake City. Quietly, without drama, slumped in her seat like she had simply fallen asleep and failed to wake up. When the conductor asked questions, no one had answers. No family, no companions, no claims. Sara found her name in the woman's coat pocket, along with a letter and train voucher meant for a Gerald Tanner of Broken Arrow Ridge. A man who, according to the letter, was expecting a wife. A mail-order bride. Sara didn't know what she was doing when she took those papers, only that it was her only way forward. Now she stood on a worn wooden platform in a town that barely deserved the name. The air smelled of smoke and pine, with a touch of manure. A few townspeople passed by and glanced at her, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. No one offered help. Hours passed. The sun had begun its slow slide down the mountains when the man arrived on horseback, muddy from the trail. He dismounted like he did it every day, handed the reins to a stable boy, and walked toward her without rush, without welcome. Broad-shouldered coat, dusted in travel grime, jaw shadowed in stubble. He moved like a man who trusted nothing he couldn't fix with a hammer or a rifle. Gerald Tanner. He stopped a few paces in front of her. Sara held out the letter, hands shaking slightly. His eyes were the color of wet slate. He took the paper, read it once, then looked her over from boots to brow. "You're not what I expected," he said flatly. Sara tried to smile, but it faltered. "It was a hard journey. I lost my coat. My other things were stolen in Salt Lake. You're Pearl Coulter." She hesitated a half-beat too long. "Yes." Gerald didn't speak for a moment. Behind him, from the folds of his heavy coat, a child peeked out. A little girl no older than 5. Pale, solemn, with dark ringlets and 2 big eyes. She didn't blink, didn't speak. Gerald muttered something under his breath and turned as if to walk away. This was a mistake. Sara felt her lungs tighten. She could feel the lie unraveling already. She would be left here alone, cold and exposed, just like before. Then the child moved. She stepped forward without a word and took hold of Sara's skirt. Just a tiny hand barely grasping the fabric. Sara looked down, startled. The girl's lips parted. Her voice was thin as thread. "Be my mama." Gerald stopped mid-step. His head snapped around. The platform went quiet. Ivy Halpern, standing nearby with her ever-present basket of dried herbs, let out a gasp. One of the stable boys froze where he stood, holding a bucket of oats. Gerald turned, crouched down to face the girl. "Maybelline, what did you say?" She clung tighter to Sara's dress. Her eyes never left Sara's. "Mama." she whispered again, louder this time. Sarah's throat constricted. The child's face was so open, so bare. She didn't look away, didn't cry, just asked. The silence that had wrapped around Gerald like a second skin broke. He straightened, eyes unreadable. "You'll come with us," he said. Sarah blinked. "What?" "Not because I trust you," Gerald said, but because she spoke. For the first time in a year, Jeremy Boone, the town's sheriff, leaned against a beam just beyond the ticket office, arms crossed, hat low over his brow, a badge catching the last light of day. He had been watching the whole exchange, eyes sharp as flint. Sarah felt the weight of his gaze. When Gerald placed a steady hand on her back and guided her toward a waiting wagon, Jeremy didn't move, but his eyes narrowed. Not with curiosity, with calculation. As Sarah climbed into the back of the wagon, Maybelline climbed in beside her and nestled under her arm without a word. Sarah didn't move, didn't dare. Gerald climbed up front, took the reins in his calloused hands, and started them down the muddy track toward the distant ridge. The wheels creaked, the town fell away, and the mountains loomed closer with every jolt of the cart. Sarah glanced back only once. Sheriff Jeremy Boone was still standing there, eyes locked on her. And the look on his face said one thing clearly: "I know you're lying. I just don't know why yet." The road to the Tanner ranch twisted through pine and fog, climbing higher into the ridge country until Broken Arrow Ridge faded behind them. The wagon jolted with each rut in the dirt path, but Gerald didn't speak. Maybelline lay curled against Sarah's side, her tiny fingers gripping a handful of Sarah's skirt like she feared being pulled away. Sarah tried not to shiver, though the mountain wind had teeth. She studied the man driving, Gerald Tanner, his posture straight, his silence dense. He hadn't asked her a single question since the station. And though Sarah had braced herself for interrogation, it was his stillness that unnerved her more. The Tanner homestead came into view near dusk. The house stood solemn against the slope, 2 stories of weathered timber, with a pitched roof and stone chimney that still smoked. Surrounding it were barns, fenced pastures, and snow-damp outbuildings, all dusted with thaw. The place was beautiful in the way old battlefields are, proud, enduring, but haunted. Gerald pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch. "You'll sleep in the spare room upstairs," he said. "My daughter's in the room across the hall. Kitchen's downstairs, water's out back." Sarah helped Maybelline down from the wagon and followed Gerald toward the door. The girl's grip never loosened. Inside the house was clean but cold. Everything was functional: rough wood floors, handmade furniture, iron stove, but there was no softness, no hint of warmth beyond necessity. A fire burned low in the hearth, and the smell of ash clung to the walls. Gerald pointed up the stairs. "Second door on the right." Sarah nodded and guided Maybelline toward the steps. But as they passed a door at the end of the hall, she noticed something odd: a heavy brass lock on the outside. It was the only door on the floor, without a handle, only a keyhole. She paused. "That's my wife's room," Gerald said sharply behind her. "It stays closed." Sarah nodded quickly and continued. Upstairs, her room was simple: an iron-framed bed, a small dresser, a window looking out toward the woods. She set her bag on the floor and turned to Maybelline, who stood in the center of the room, still silent, watching. Sarah knelt. "You're safe here," she said softly. The girl said nothing, but when Sarah opened her arms, she stepped into them, without hesitation. The next morning brought gray skies and low fog that clung to the treetops. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, but didn't find Gerald in the kitchen. Maybelline sat at the table spooning oatmeal, slowly, her eyes tracking Sarah's every move. The child hadn't spoken again. Sarah made herself useful. She swept the kitchen, washed dishes, even chopped a few vegetables for the stew pot. She was trying to earn her place, even if it wasn't really hers to earn. By mid-morning, Gerald returned from tending the horses' CCS. He nodded once at Sarah's work, but said nothing. His eyes lingered briefly on Maybelline, then the locked door before he headed back outside. Sara watched him go. Then she turned to Maybelline. "Does he always talk that little?" The girl blinked once. Sara smiled to herself. "I guess that's a yes." That afternoon, Sara ventured into town to fetch supplies. She walked Maybelline's hand in hers. The mud sucked at their boots, and the clouds above rumbled like a distant threat. In the mercantile whispers followed her. She heard her name, or rather Pearl's name, spoken behind hands. "Mail-order bride," someone said. "Pretty but too young. He must be desperate. She's not the first strange woman he's brought up to that house." Sara kept her chin up, but her stomach turned. Mrs. Ivy Halpern appeared near the dry goods and made no attempt to whisper. "Strange thing him taking another so soon," she said loud enough for the room to hear. "Don't you think, dear? After what happened to the first one?" Sara turned. "What happened?" Ivy's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You mean he didn't tell you poor Alice Tanner fell right off the ridge? Body wasn't found until spring thaw. Some say she slipped. Some say otherwise. Otherwise, let's just say the snow buries more than footprints in these parts." Sara gripped the edge of the shelf. Ivy leaned closer. "Men out here bury secrets, like Bones' child. And winter keeps them quiet." Then she plucked a tin of flour and walked off without another word. That night, back at the ranch, Sara sat by the fire, while Maybelline played with a few hand-carved figurines. Gerald read from a worn ledger, his face lit orange by the flames. Sara hesitated, then asked, "Did your wife, did she really fall?" Gerald didn't look up. "She died." "But how?" He turned the page. "It's not your concern." Sara pressed her lips together and dropped the subject. But later, while folding laundry in her room, she turned out the pockets of the wool coat she had worn from the train. Pearl's coat. The lining was torn near the seam. As she prodded it, something crinkled under her fingers. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old, faded, and on it in bold black ink were the words, "Wanted Pearl Coulter. Fraud, theft, impersonation, and flight from arrest." Dead or alive? Sara's heart lurched. She stuffed the paper back into the lining and stitched the seam shut with trembling hands. No one could know. Not yet. She glanced toward the hallway where the locked door remained as still and quiet as a sealed grave. And she realized something chilling. Gerald Tanner hadn't ordered a bride. He hadn't expected her. And that meant whoever had ordered Pearl Coulter was still out there and still waiting. 3 days passed at the Tanner homestead, each one settling over Sara like a fresh blanket of snow, silent, cold, and deceptive in its calm. The house was functional, but empty of warmth, not from lack of fire, but lack of trust. Gerald kept his distance, his words economical, his expression unreadable. Maybelline, in contrast, clung to Sara with fierce quiet, still mute, but always close, as if Sara were the only solid ground in a shifting world. Sara moved carefully. Every step, every word, every glance was measured. She cooked, cleaned, fed the chickens, and swept the porch, all in silence. It was easier than talking. Safer too. But in her mind, one name wouldn't stop ringing: Pearl. She hadn't heard it spoken since the train. Not until that morning. Sara was feeding the hens when the sound of hooves crunching against gravel caught her ear. She turned, shielding her eyes from the sun. It wasn't Gerald. It was Sheriff Jeremy Boone. He dismounted with practiced ease, brushing dust from his coat as he approached. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Sara straightened, clutching the feed pail. "About what?" Jeremy's gaze was sharp, his tone sharper. "You're not Pearl Coulter." Her chest tightened. "I don't know what." "Don't lie," he snapped. I knew Pearl. I dealt with her in Cheyenne 2 years back. She conned a banker out of $200 and left a trail of fake names across 3 counties. She had a snake tattoo on her ankle and a scar behind her right ear. You've got neither. Sara swallowed hard. I gave it a few days. He said, quieter now. Watched you. I figured maybe you were running and maybe she's dead. But I was wrong. Someone saw her yesterday, near the old mine shaft, alive and smirking. Sara's blood went cold. Pearl's alive. Jeremy nodded. And I have a hunch she's not here for a family reunion. Sara's hands shook. She stared at the sheriff, torn between fear and shame. I didn't mean to lie, she said. I need it out. Jeremy folded his arms. Out of what? So she told him. About Boston. About the uncle who sold her name to a brothel. About the men who came knocking about the night she ran. About the train. Pearl's lifeless body. The letter in the coat. The desperate decision. Jeremy listened, jaw set, eyes narrowed. When she finished, he was silent a long moment. I ought to arrest you, he said finally. But I won't. Not yet. What you did was foolish. But maybe not wrong. He tipped his hat. She'll come for you, Sara. That woman doesn't let go of things. Especially not what she thinks belongs to her. With that, he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a storm in Sara's chest. That evening, Pearl Coulter rode into Broken Arrow Ridge. She wore a blood-red riding dress and sat her horse like a queen, returning from exile. Her hair was the same vibrant auburn Sara remembered from the train. Her smile was slow and knowing. The townsfolk parted as she passed, unsure whether to greet her or bolt. Pearl dismounted in front of the saloon and walked through its doors like she owned the floor beneath her boots. Sara stood frozen outside the mercantile, watching through the window. Pearl didn't see her, not yet. But Sara knew it was only a matter of time. She rushed back to the ranch, her breath tight in her chest. That night, Gerald came home late, boots, muddy coat, damp with sweat and dusk. Sara met him at the porch. She's back, she said. He paused. I know. Sara studied him. You knew her. His jaw worked before he replied. A long time ago. Before your wife. He didn't meet her eyes. Yes. We were foolish. I thought she was wild in a good way. Turns out she was just wild. Did she know your wife? Gerald's silence was answer enough. Sara nodded slowly. She came back for something. Gerald's eyes darkened. She always does. Inside, Maybelline sat on the floor with crayons and paper. She hadn't drawn much in days, but now she worked with quiet intensity, lips pressed tight in concentration. What are you making, sweet girl? Sara asked, kneeling beside her. Maybelline didn't speak. She held up the paper. It was a crude drawing, childlike but clear. 2 stick figures stood on a sharp ledge. One with long red hair, the other with arms flailing mid-fall. Sara stared at it, heart stalling. Gerald stepped forward, took the drawing and crouched before his daughter. When did you see this? Maybelline didn't speak. She just pointed toward the mountains. Sara felt the floor tilt beneath her. You think she saw? Her voice trailed off. Gerald's voice was hoarse. Alice. Sara turned to the window. The ridge loomed in the distance, sharp against the purple dusk. Pearl didn't come back to start over, she whispered. Gerald nodded grimly. She came to finish what she started. The storm came without warning. It had been a strange spring days, warm enough to melt snow nights, cold enough to freeze it again. But that morning, the wind shifted. Clouds swept in fast, thick and gray, swallowing the sky. By noon, snow was falling sideways, blown by a wind that screamed like it had something to say. Gerald had spent the early morning hauling firewood into the house. He boarded shut the small barn windows, tied the horses with double knots, and checked the chimney flue 3 times. His hands moved with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd lived through too many winters not to take one seriously. "We're not going anywhere for a while," he said, closing the heavy front door with a thud. Sara stood at the hearth, ladling stew into bowls, her hands steady, despite the howling outside. Maybelline sat cross-legged on the rug blanket over her shoulders, her eyes following every movement her father made. That evening, the snow came harder. It fell in thick curtains, blotting out the world beyond the windows. The storm was a wall, and they were 3 souls trapped inside. They ate in silence. When Maybelline had been put to bed after 2 lullabies and a story whispered by Sara, Gerald poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, elbows on the wood, staring into nothing. Sara didn't press, but something in the storm loosened tongues. "She wasn't well," he said suddenly. Sara looked up from the sink. "Your wife," he nodded. "Alice." She saw things that weren't there, heard voices, thought people were watching her through the trees. His voice was rough, low. "I tried to get help. Brought her to town. The doctor said it was nerves. Hysteria." Sara sat across from him, hands folded. "Was it? She wasn't always like that. After May was born, it got worse. The cold months were hardest. The dark made her mind colder too." "Did she?" Sara paused. "Did she jump?" Gerald looked at her, his face unreadable. "I believed she did. Until May drew that picture." He took a sip from his mug, then pushed it aside. "Now I'm not sure what I believe." The fire cracked. Outside, the wind screamed louder, rattling the windows like angry fists. Sara stood. "I'll check on May." She walked down the hallway and opened the child's door. Maybelline was fast asleep, her tiny form bundled in quilts, her face peaceful for once. A sharp sound cut through the stillness. A crack. Then a muffled scream from the barn. Sara ran. By the time she reached the back porch, flames were already licking the skiffy foyer. The barn was ablaze red and orange against the white of snow, a glowing monster devouring wood and hay. Gerald stormed past her, grabbing a bucket from the pump, shouting, "The horses, I'll get Maybelline," she screamed, spinning back toward the house. The fire roared behind her, louder than the wind. Sparks lifted into the air like fireflies swallowed by snow. Inside, Sara grabbed Maybelline from her bed and wrapped her in a wool coat. The child blinked, confused, but didn't cry. Sara carried her down the stairs, heart hammering. Through the window, she saw Gerald dragging the stable door open, horses rearing, smoke pouring out like breath from a dragon's mouth. He disappeared into the inferno. A figure moved in the shadows. Sara froze. It wasn't Gerald. On the far side of the barn, someone ran small, quick, cloaked in black. The shape moved through snow like smoke. For a moment, the flames caught the edge of red hair. Pearl. She vanished into the trees. Gerald stumbled back into view, coughing, his coat scorched, leading 2 frantic horses through the snow. He tied them near the water trough and turned toward the house. Sara burst through the door with Maybelline in her arms. "We're safe," she said breathlessly. "But I saw her." Gerald's eyes snapped to hers. "Pearl," she nodded. "She set the fire." They stood there, breath steaming, snow melting on their clothes. The barn collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks. The next morning dawned pale and quiet. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a blanket of snow and charred ruin. The barn was a blackened skeleton. Gerald dug through the rubble, boots crunching over ash and half-melted timber. Sara stayed with Maybelline near the porch, wrapping the girl in quilts and whispering stories that neither of them really heard. Then Gerald called out. Sara rushed to him. He stood beside what remained of the tack wall, where iron bits and buckles hung like twisted relics. In his gloved hand he held a half-burned music box, its metal blackened wood cracked, but somehow still intact. Sara took it gently. It looked like nothing special, plain square old. She turned it over. Something rattled inside. With trembling fingers, she opened the lid. Inside was ash soot and a folded piece of scorched parchment. She pulled it out carefully. The handwriting was delicate fading, but unmistakable. It was addressed to Sheriff Jeremy Boone. Sara read aloud. If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident. Pearl has secrets buried deep, and Jeremy helps her keep them. Don't trust either of them. Tell Maybelline I tried to protect her. Tell Gerald I loved him, even when he couldn't see it. Alice Tanner. Sara looked up, eyes wide. Gerald's face was stone. The snow fell in gentle flakes around them, soft as breath. But the truth no longer slept beneath the ice. It was burning. The letter changed everything. Sara read it 3 times that morning, once in silence, once aloud to Gerald, and once just to feel Alice Tanner's words echo in the still air of the cabin. Her script was small, elegant, rushed. Burn marks licked at the edges of the parchment, but the message survived the fire, like a voice refusing to be silenced. If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident. Pearl has secrets buried deep, and Jeremy helps her keep them. Don't trust either of them. Tell Maybelline I tried to protect her. Tell Gerald I loved him, even when he couldn't see it. Gerald sat motionless by the fire, the letter in his hands, his eyes fixed on the final line. Outside, the snow gleamed under the returning sun, deceptive in its purity. She knew, he said at last, his voice distant. She knew what was coming. Sara wrapped her shawl tighter, and she tried to leave something behind. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Gerald stood slowly, deliberately. I'm going to town. Sara looked up sharply. To see Jeremy? He nodded once. Time for some answers. The sheriff's office sat on the edge of Main Street, next to the general store, and across from the church, like a watchful eye over the town. Gerald's boots echoed on the wooden boards as he stepped inside. Sara followed the letter tucked in her coat. Jeremy Boone looked up from his desk, surprise flickering in his eyes before it faded into something cooler. Didn't expect you in today, he said. Storm just cleared. Gerald said nothing. Sara stepped forward and dropped the letter onto his desk. Jeremy's face shifted. His eyes scanned the paper, his jaw set. He didn't ask where they'd found it. You should have burned that, he muttered. Sara's voice cut like ice. She was your wife's sister, wasn't she? Jeremy's silence confirmed it, before his words did. Half-sister. Same father. Different mothers. Pearl always hated Alice. Said she was the soft one. The one who got the family name and the land and the man. And the mine, Gerald said darkly. Jeremy's eyes flicked to him. There's nothing left in that hole. But you thought there was once, Sara snapped. Enough to forge claims, enough to silence anyone who knew the truth. Jeremy rose slowly from his chair. Watch your tone. Gerald stepped closer. Alice died on that ridge. Everyone said she jumped. But my daughter drew what she saw, Pearl pushing someone. You've got no proof, Jeremy said. Sara pulled out a folded drawing from her pocket, the one Maybelline had made. She laid it beside the letter. You have a 5-year-old witness and a dead woman's warning. Jeremy stared at both for a long time. Then, with a sigh heavy as snowfall, he sat back down. I didn't push her, he said. But I didn't stop Pearl either. Alice confronted her about the forged deeds, about the mine rights. They fought. I was there just below the ridge, heard the scream, saw Pearl coming down alone. Sara felt sick. You helped hide it, she said. Jeremy didn't deny it. If that mine was worth anything, it could have saved this town, kept folks fed through the winter. Pearl said Alice slipped. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. Gerald growled. And you let her die thinking no one would ever know. Jeremy stood. What do you want to find the truth, Sara said. The rest of it. Gerald and Sara rode out that afternoon, bundled against the melting snow, following a half-forgotten trail behind the ridge. Maybelline stayed with Mrs. Halpern, who offered no judgment, only quiet bread and a thick quilt. The path led through narrow pines and past rusted fence posts. Eventually, they reached what remained of the old shaft, a rotted timber frame half-collapsed, dark as a wound in the earth. "This was my grandfather's," Gerald said, "abandoned long before I was born." They dismounted. Sara led the way, holding a lantern from her saddlebag. Behind the mine entrance, just beyond the shelter of the trees, the ground sloped into a quiet hollow. It was there in the thawing soil that the truth waited. Gerald knelt. "I used to play here when I was a boy. We called it the boneyard, used to pretend it held gold." Now, he picked up a shovel. They dug in silence, the wind whispering through pine needles above. Snow melted into their boots. The earth was stubborn, but after an hour they found it. A crossbeam, then fabric, then the unmistakable curve of a human skull. Sara covered her mouth. Gerald stopped digging. The grave was shallow, haphazard. No marker, no care. "I knew she was missing," he said quietly. "I just didn't know she was here." Sara stepped closer. She tried to stop them, and they buried her like she was nothing. Gerald's hands were shaking. He sat back on his heels. "I believed what they told me. That she wandered off. That she broke. I thought maybe I hadn't done enough." "You believed what they needed you to believe," Sara said, "so they could keep their secret." He nodded slowly, staring at the broken earth. Sara sat beside him. The air was cold, but the truth burned. "Maybelline saw it," she said. "The fall. The push. She held it all inside." Gerald closed his eyes. "And I never knew." Sara touched his hand. "But you do now." They sat together in the quiet, two souls beside the grave of a woman neither of them could save, but both could finally mourn. The sun dipped low behind the ridge, and the snow began to fall again, soft as ash, gentle as grace. The town hall had never been so full. Men stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the tall rafters. Women lined the benches in their Sunday dresses, hands clutching handkerchiefs or twisting rosary beads. Even the children were silent. All eyes turned to the center, where a makeshift tribunal had been assembled. No judge, no gavel, just Gerald Tanner standing like a mountain, unshakable, and Pearl Coulter dressed in crimson silk, defiant as ever. Sara sat at the side beside Mrs. Halpern, hands folded in her lap, to stop them from trembling. Jeremy Boone stood behind Pearl Hat, unhatched, sweat at his temples. He hadn't spoken much since the body was found near the old mine. But his silence tonight would be impossible. Gerald's voice cut through the murmurs. "We all knew my wife Alice was troubled, but we also knew she was kind and she loved our daughter fiercely. When she died, we said it was the wind or the dark, or her own sorrow." He paused. But that wasn't the truth. He held up the music box still charred from the fire, and then unfolded the letter Alice had written. The room fell silent. Sara watched Pearl's expression carefully. No flicker of guilt, no twitch of remorse. Gerald continued. "She knew someone was after her. She named them. And when my daughter drew what she saw, a woman with red hair, pushing another off a ridge, I had no choice but to act." He turned to Jeremy. "Sheriff Boone, you were there that night. You helped hide it." Jeremy looked ready to faint. But Pearl spoke first. "You're pointing fingers at ghosts," she sneered. "That girl," she thrust a finger toward Sara. "She's not who she says she is. She stole my name, my letters, my life. She's a liar, a thief. Everything she told you is a performance." The crowd stirred. Pearl's voice rose. "Ask her. Ask her where she came from. Ask her what happened to the real Pearl Coulter. She can't answer because she doesn't know." All eyes turned to Sara. She stood slowly. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. The real Pearl died on that train. I didn't kill her. I didn't even know her. But I took her letter because it was the only way I could escape something worse. I never meant to hurt any. She's a fraud, Pearl shouted. Sara didn't flinch. Maybe I am. But I didn't set fire to a barn. I didn't push a woman off a ridge. And I sure as hell didn't spend my life ruining others just to feel powerful. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Then Gerald turned to Jeremy. It's time. Jeremy looked at Pearl, then at the townsfolk, then at the floor. I didn't push Alice, he said quietly. But I knew Pearl had motive. And when Alice died, I helped Pearl cover it up. Because I believed what she told me. That it was an accident. That if word got out, the mine rights would be lost. The town would suffer. He looked up. But that doesn't excuse what we did. Pearl scoffed. You pathetic coward. Jeremy's hand trembled. I'm turning myself in. Gasps echoed. But Pearl laughed. You think that's enough. You think these fools care about your guilt. They just want someone to blame. She turned toward Sara again, ready to strike with another venomous word, when a small voice pierced the air. She pushed Mama. All eyes turned. Maybelline Tanner stood in the aisle, tiny hands clenched at her sides, voice soft but steady. She pushed Mama, she repeated. Gasps again. Pearl's face went pale. She's 5. She doesn't know what she saw. Gerald stepped forward. Maybelline? Are you sure? The little girl nodded. I was there. Mama cried. She said no. Then the lady with the red hair pushed her. Tears welled in Sara's eyes. Maybelline walked up to her father and held his hand. I didn't say it before. Because I was scared. Gerald knelt, pulling her close. You were brave, May. You were so brave. The room turned. Pearl backed up a step, then another. When Sheriff Boone moved to grab her arm, she twisted away and bolted. Get her, someone shouted. She shoved past the crowd out the door into the night. Hooves thundered. Someone had left a horse untied. By the time Jeremy reached the street, she was gone. A few men gave chase. Gerald didn't move. He was kneeling beside his daughter, holding her, holding the truth. The hall emptied slowly. Sara stood by the hearth, watching the last of the lanterns dim. Mrs. Halpern approached. She'll be found. But tonight, you helped that child find her voice. That counts for something. Sara nodded, but her heart was heavy. Later at the Tanner house, Sara packed her bag in silence. The coat, the letter, a single dress. She didn't have much. She never had. She paused in the doorway of Maybelline's room, watching the child sleep finally at peace. Downstairs, Gerald was placing firewood in the hearth. He turned when he saw her. You're leaving, he said. I thought I was here to help, she said. But maybe I was just convenient. A way to uncover the truth. He walked toward her, slow and steady. You think I brought you here because I needed someone to solve a mystery? Sara shrugged. Isn't that what happened? Gerald stopped inches from her. No. You were here when she needed you. When I needed you. And not because you pretended to be someone else, but because you never stopped trying to be yourself. She didn't speak, but her hands loosened around the bag. You're not a replacement, he said. You're a choice. Her breath caught. I'm not asking you to stay tonight, he added gently. But maybe tomorrow. And somehow in that silence, it was enough. The train platform looked just as it had the day Sara first arrived. Sparse, windswept, blanketed by a quiet that only small mountain towns could conjure. The snow had melted now, replaced by wild grass peeking through the earth. A robin hopped across the wooden boards. The morning sun rose gently over Broken Arrow Ridge, casting gold on the horizon. Sara stood alone by the bench, her carpetbag by her feet. She wore the same travel-worn coat, but beneath it, she was not the same woman. Her shoulders no longer slouched in fear. Her eyes no longer searched for shadows. The distant sound of hooves reached her first. Then the sight of a familiar figure, Tully and Zur on horseback. Gerald Tanner. And in front of him, riding with small hands wrapped around the horn of the saddle, was Maybelline. The child's curls bounced with every step of the mare. Her dress was yellow. In her hand a single white daisy. Gerald dismounted first, then lifted Maybelline down. They walked toward Sara. The girl didn't hesitate. She crossed the distance on her own, then stood in front of Sara, small face tilted up. "Come home, Mama," she said. Sara's throat tightened. Gerald stopped beside them, his hat in his hands. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept all night, but his voice when he spoke was steady. "I never ordered a bride," he said softly. "That's the truth." Sara nodded, lips parting to speak, but he held up a hand. "But maybe fate did. And I've learned not to argue with fate." The wind whispered through the tall grass. Gerald knelt, taking Maybelline's hand, then reached for Sara's. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he said. "I held my grief so tight, I didn't think there'd be room for anyone else. But you didn't ask for a place, you earned one. Every day." Sara looked at the girl. "I'm scared," she whispered. "What if I can't be what she needs?" Maybelline held out the daisy. "You already are." Tears stung her eyes. She dropped to her knees and wrapped the child in her arms. Maybelline clung to her like she had never let go. Gerald stepped close and rested a hand on both of them. No promises, no speeches, just presence, just choice. That afternoon, the house on the ridge breathed differently. Sara stood in the once locked room. The wallpaper was faded, the floorboards dusty, but it didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt like a beginning. She pulled back the curtains, those thick gray drapes, and replaced them with soft muslin ones she'd sewn herself. Light poured in. She placed a rocking chair near the window, a jar of pencils and colored pastels on a shelf. It would be Maybelline's art room now. Downstairs, Gerald was mending a fence post. The rhythmic sound of his hammer echoed like a heartbeat. Later, Sara joined him on the porch. She poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed him one. He accepted it with a small smile. "I thought I'd lost everything," he said. "You didn't," she replied. "You just hadn't found it yet." He reached for her hand and held it gently. They sat that way for a long time, watching the breeze ripple across the grass. And then laughter. Maybelline burst through the front door barefoot, her curls wild and free. She clutched a drawing in her hand, waving it proudly. "Look," she cried. "It's us." The picture showed 3 stick figures beneath a big sun, a horse and the house with flowers around it. Above their heads in shaky letters, it read, "Home." Gerald kissed her forehead. Sara hugged her. And the 3 of them saddled up that evening, just as the sun dipped low over Broken Arrow Ridge. Maybelline rode with Gerald. Sara followed beside them, hair catching the wind. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their laughter echoed over the plains. In the soft gold of a Wyoming spring, where the snow had finally melted and the grass grew green again, 3 hearts rode together, not by accident, not by duty, but by choice. And in that choice, they found something rare, something powerful. They found family. If this story touched something quiet in your soul, if you believe love can bloom even after the frost, don't let it end here. Share it. And remember, on the frontier, hearts don't fall. They choose the end.